All right, so get this. We are going deep today, like really deep, into a cold case, the kind that just like grabs you and, it doesn't let go. You find yourself up at like 2 a.m. wondering what happened. That's what we're talking about today, the unsolved murder of Jean Townsend.
Oh, yeah.
Back in 1954. Post-war Britain, still getting back on its feet after the war. And a place like Ruislip, Middlesex,
Yeah.
seemed, I don't know, peaceful, right? Like safe. And Jean, she was 21, worked as a theatrical costumier, lived and worked in this seemingly safe world,
Right.
and she would travel into London for her job, into, the busy West End. But then her life, it was cut short, and it remains a mystery even today.
You know, what I find so interesting about this case is that it really shows us the anxieties kind of bubbling under the surface in post-war Britain. So you have this background of recovery, right? But then at the same time, you still have American servicemen around. They were allies, sure, during the war.
Mm-hmm.
But having them there in peacetime, it created this really complex mix of emotions for a lot of Britons.
Yeah, for sure. It wasn't simple at all. Not black and white. So, okay, imagine this. September 14th, 1954. Jean, she goes to this social function in the West End, enjoys her night out, has a good time, takes the last train back home, and someone sees her leaving South Ruislip Station around 11:45 p.m. Just a normal night, right?
Right.
But it's the last time anyone sees her alive.
It's chilling
Yeah.
to think about that. And then the next morning, her body is discovered on this piece of waste ground near a road junction. Waste ground in 1950s Britain. That meant like undeveloped areas, abandoned places.
Yeah.
Often on the outskirts of towns. It's in this kind of desolate spot that they find her body.
Wow.
And it just sends shockwaves through the community.
I can only imagine the fear.
Yeah.
I mean, here's this young woman living her life, and suddenly she's just gone. And the way she was found, strangled with her own scarf.
Yeah, and the details. They really just make it even more mysterious. Some of her clothing was removed, but no signs of sexual assault. So right away, that throws a wrench into things. Like, investigators would typically assume certain things about the motive, but it doesn't fit. Was it robbery? Did it go wrong? Or was there something else, something more sinister happening?
A message, almost. But what was the message? And I mean, come on. Anytime you have a case like this, the rumors, they just explode, right? Like wildfire.
Oh, yeah.
And in this case, immediately, suspicion falls on the American servicemen, the one stationed at the nearby South Ruislip Air Station.
Right. And it's important to remember, it wasn't just random suspicion. There were real concerns about how some of the servicemen were behaving. I mean, think about it. This is a time when cultural differences, they were much more pronounced, and there was friction between locals and those American military personnel.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then there's this detail that just throws more fuel on the fire. A resident, they live near the crime scene. They said they heard a woman cry for help that night.
Oh, wow.
Followed by men's voices. And one of them, they said it had an American accent.
It's like something out of a movie.
Right.
Makes you wonder.
Was this just coincidence? Or was there a connection there to the American servicemen? And then people start saying that the U.S. Air Force isn't cooperating with the investigation. It all just adds to this growing sense of unease.
Definitely. You can see how it creates this perfect storm.
Uh-huh.
Fear, suspicion.
Exactly. But let's not get too caught up in those initial anxieties about the American servicemen. Let's look at some other things. That came up in the investigation. Because what's really interesting is that a pattern starts to emerge. So after Jean's murder, other women, they come forward with these disturbing accounts.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
This is where it gets even more interesting.
It does.
So what kind of things were they saying?
So one woman, Jacqueline Cliff, she describes being approached repeatedly by this man with a high forehead and an American accent.
A high forehead.
Yeah, it's a specific detail.
It is.
And then another woman, Joan Galla, she's actually attacked late at night, and get this, on the same road where Jean was last seen alive. Yeah, and guess what? She also describes the attacker as having a high forehead.
Okay, so we had this detail appearing again. Do you think it's a real link between these incidents? Or could it be that people are just, I don't know, latching onto this detail because of the whole idea of an American serviceman being involved?
That is the billion-dollar question, right? It's a classic example of how eyewitness accounts. They can help, but they can also be problematic.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, memory, it's so fragile. It's affected by stress, fear, even, and, what they're seeing in the news.
The media can really shape perceptions.
It can.
For sure.
But on the other hand, you can't just dismiss a detail like that, especially when it keeps popping up.
That's the tough part for investigators, right?
Yeah.
Trying to figure out what's reliable, what could be a real connection,
Yeah.
and what's just a red herring.
It's like a puzzle, and you're missing half the pieces.
And then, to make things even more complicated, the investigation goes beyond South Ruislip. The police even looked into a possible link to some unsolved murders of women in West Germany.
Seriously? So now we have to consider, could this be a mobile perpetrator, maybe even an American serviceman who was stationed in both places?
It's a chilling thought, for sure.
It is.
The idea that the killer might not be limited to one specific area just adds a whole new layer to the case.
It really does. But while all this is going on, with the international angle, back in London, another possible link appears. This time, it's the murder of Ellen Carlin in Pimlico. And this is just weeks before Jean's death.
Wow, so close together.
Yeah. And Ellen, reportedly, she was seen with a man in a U.S. Air Force uniform right before she was murdered.
So we have two murders now, both young women, both happening around the same time, and both potentially connected to American servicemen. It makes you wonder,
Right.
could these be connected? Could there be a serial predator operating in different areas?
It's a terrifying thought. And then that fear, it just gets worse. 3 weeks after Jean's murder, another woman, Doris Fennell, she's attacked outside North Harrow Tube Station.
Another attack.
Yeah. And this one's important because of the similarities to Jean's case.
What do you mean?
Well, Doris, she says, that her attacker. He followed her off the train, which is what they think happened to Jean. And guess what? This attacker also has a high forehead.
There it is again, that detail.
Yeah.
You can't ignore that.
It makes you think, did this attack change things? Like, did it make the case more urgent? Did the public start to think that maybe this wasn't just a one-off, but a serial predator situation?
And how did the media react?
That's a good question. I mean, it's like they were trying to make sense of it all.
Right.
But in doing so, they might have created a narrative that overshadowed the human element of the story.
I see what you mean. And I think we need to remember, as we go through this case, that at the heart of it all is a young woman whose life was tragically taken. Jean Townsend, a daughter, a friend, a colleague, part of community her story deserves to be told with respect and sensitivity.
You're absolutely right. And we can't forget the impact this had on the whole community of Ruislip. There was this palpable sense of fear, especially for women. They were constantly looking over their shoulders, afraid to walk alone at night.
You can really feel that fear. In the newspapers, the witness statements, people were questioning their own safety. They didn't feel secure anymore.
It's understandable, though. This case, it brought up all those anxieties about outsiders. In this case, the American servicemen. Jean's murder became this symbol, almost.
It's like a focal point for all those fears.
Of the potential dangers lurking beneath the surface of everyday life.
It's interesting how one event can become a lightning rod for these bigger societal anxieties. And it's not just the immediate impact, but the way those anxieties linger. They shape perceptions and even how the investigation goes.
It's true. And as we move forward, it's interesting to see how the media coverage of the case, it changes. At first, right after the murder, the focus was local, the community, the search for clues, interviews with witnesses. But as time goes on and the case stays unsolved, the coverage, the tone, it shifts.
Wow.
It gets more sensationalized. The headlines get bolder.
Oh, yeah.
The language more dramatic.
Right. Trying to make it more entertaining almost.
Yeah, like they needed a compelling story. And in doing that, they might have accidentally contributed to the mythologizing of the case.
And then you get that phrase, Ruislip's murder mile. That really captures that.
It does, doesn't it? It's catchy. It definitely gets your attention. But it also reduces these complex, tragic events to a simple headline.
Exactly. And that's where the ethics come in, right?
It's
What's the responsibility of the media when reporting on cold cases? How do we keep these cases in the public eye, but also respect the victims and their families?
It's a tough balance. You want to keep people interested, hoping someone with information comes forward.
Right.
But you also don't want to exploit anyone or spread misinformation.
And we have to think about the community, too. Sensationalized coverage. It can bring up old wounds, rekindle those fears, and even hurt the investigation by creating distractions or false leads.
Which brings us to another part of this case that's shrouded in secrecy, the sealed police files. So in 2005, a family friend, they tried to access them. through a Freedom of Information Act request, but it was denied. And those files are sealed. Until 2031.
I can understand why they'd want to protect that information, especially in an unsolved case. There could be details in there about witnesses, investigative techniques, even potential suspects. That could really mess things up if they were made public.
Right.
But it's also frustrating, right, for the people who want answers.
Totally. It's like this giant question mark hanging over everything. What's in those files? What's so sensitive? National security, protecting witnesses who are still alive. Or is it something else entirely?
Who knows? But sealing those files until 2031, it just fuels speculation. People are going to wonder, is there a key piece of evidence hidden in there? A name, a detail, something that could solve the whole thing?
And that's part of what makes cold cases so fascinating, right? That possibility, that maybe someday the truth will come out.
It's that hope that keeps investigators going. And researchers and even armchair detectives, they pore over the details, trying to find those connections, trying to make sense of it all.
Exactly. But for now, until those files are open, we have to work with what we have, analyze the different theories, and try to piece together what happened.
It's like a tapestry. With some of the threads missing, we're trying to see the whole picture. But those missing threads, they can be frustrating. But they also make it more intriguing.
Exactly. They make you want to speculate, connect the dots yourself, become a detective.
And there's this element of historical voyeurism, too, isn't there? We're peeking into the past, trying to understand the social norms, the culture of a different time. And we see these glimpses of anxieties, fears, societal issues that are still relevant today.
I completely agree. It's like holding up a mirror to ourselves, looking at how far we've come and how much we still need to learn. These themes, the fear of the outsider, anxieties about safety, questions about justice, accountability, they transcend time and place.
And by exploring them through this cold case, through Jean Townsend's story, we can gain a deeper understanding not only of the past, but also of ourselves and the world we live in today.
Absolutely.
So with everything we've talked about, all the evidence, the theories, what do you find most perplexing about this case?
For me, it always comes back to the motive. Why? Was Jean's murder a crime of opportunity, just random violence by someone she met on her way home? Or was it targeted? Was there a reason? A personal connection, a grudge, a secret someone wanted to keep hidden?
That's a question that really lingers, especially with the lack of sexual assault. If it wasn't robbery and it wasn't a crime of passion, what else could it be?
And we can't rule out the possibility that this was part of a larger pattern of violence against women, the similarities in the attacks, the descriptions of the attacker, the locations. It's hard to ignore.
It is unsettling to think there might be a connection, that there might be other victims, those stories we haven't heard yet. And the fact that some of those cases are still unsolved, it just adds to the mystery and the urgency of finding answers.
Now let's fast forward a bit to 1971, another murder. This time Gloria Booth, a 29-year-old housewife. And she's found strangled with a scarf, just like Jean Townsend. And this is where that term Ruislip's murder mile really takes hold.
Wow, even after all these years, the shadow of Jean's murder is still hanging over the community?
It is. It's like, because Jean's case was never solved, it created this unsettling feeling.
Like something was still out there.
Yeah, something dark and unresolved lurking beneath the surface.
And it's not just Jean's case. We've seen all these other unsolved murders, attacks on women. That might be connected. It's like a puzzle with so many pieces missing, and each unsolved crime just makes it more complex.
It really does.
That term Ruislip's murder mile, it sounds sensationalized, sure, but it reflects a real fear that the community felt. This was before instant information, 24/7 news. People relied on local papers, word of mouth, and their imaginations to fill in the gaps.
And when there are no answers, fear and speculation take over.
Naturally.
It's human nature. We try to create a story to make sense of the chaos.
Even if it means stretching the truth a little.
Yeah.
And the media, they play a role in that, whether they mean to or not. Think about how that term, Ruislip's murder mile, it's stuck around all these years.
It has.
It's become part of the local folklore, a reminder of those unsolved crimes.
The term itself has become this self-perpetuating thing, fear, fascination.
Exactly.
But we have to remember, these are real cases.
Right.
Real victims. Their stories deserve to be told with sensitivity and respect.
Absolutely. That's where responsible journalism comes in.
Yeah.
And ethical investigation. We need to inform the public, but we also need to protect the privacy and dignity of everyone involved, finding the truth without exploiting the tragedy.
And remembering that behind every cold case are families and friends who are still hurting, still looking for answers, still hoping for justice.
And that pain, it doesn't go away with time. It often gets worse.
It's heartbreaking for the families
Yeah.
and for anyone who believes that justice can prevail,
Even after all this time.
even after
It
decades.
shows us that the search for justice, it's not always easy. It's a long road with obstacles, setbacks, false hope.
It is.
But even with all that, we have to keep searching, keep asking questions, keep the memory of the victims alive.
Because even if we never find all the answers, the fact that we're searching, remembering, not letting these cases be forgotten, it's a powerful statement.
It is.
It honors the victims, acknowledges their lives, their loss, and it reminds the world that they haven't been forgotten.
Sometimes that's all we can do, but it's still important.
It is. So for our listener who's been on this deep dive with us into the unsolved murder of Jean Townsend,
Yeah.
what do you hope they take away from this story?
I hope they see how complex these cold cases are. They're not just puzzles to solve. They're windows into the past, reflections of our anxieties as a society, and most importantly, reminders of the human cost of violence, and that we need justice. We need to keep searching for it.
Well said. And who knows, maybe someone listening has a piece of the puzzle, a memory, a detail that could help close Jean Townsend's story. It's never too late to come forward, share what you know, help bring peace to those who have waited so long.
Even if you don't have direct information, you can still help by keeping the story alive, talking about it,
Yeah.
sharing it. Sometimes all it takes is one conversation, one spark of recognition to ignite that flame of justice.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, we want to leave you with this thought. What unsolved mysteries are you drawn to? What cold cases capture your imagination?
Don't be afraid to explore them. Ask questions. Dig deeper. You never know what you might find, or how your curiosity might contribute to the search for truth and justice.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. And remember, every cold case is a story waiting to be told, a voice waiting to be heard. Let's keep listening.
Yeah, it almost feels like, because Jean's case was never solved, it created this unsettling feeling in the community.
Right, like something was still out there.
Exactly, something dark and unresolved lurking beneath the surface.
And it's not just Jean's case, right? We've talked about all these other unsolved murders and attacks on women in the area, and some of them might be connected to Jean's case.
It's true. It's like a puzzle with so many missing pieces, and
Yeah.
each unsolved crime just makes it more complex.
It really does.
That term, Ruslip's murder mile, it sounds sensationalized,
It does.
but it reflects a very real fear that the community felt.
Yeah.
And you have to remember, this was before, instant information, 24/7 news cycle.
Right, things were different then.
No, people relied on local papers, word of mouth, their own imaginations to fill in the gaps.
And when there are no answers, well, fear and speculation, they kind of take over, don't they?
It's natural. It's human nature. We try to create a story to make sense of the chaos.
Even if it means, like, exaggerating or distorting the truth sometimes.
Right. And the media, sometimes they play a role in that, whether they mean to or not.
Like with that term, Ruslip's murder mile, it's stuck around all these years.
It has. It's become part of the local folklore, a chilling reminder of these unsolved crimes.
It's like the term itself has taken on a life of its own, this cycle of fear and fascination.
Exactly.
But we can't forget, behind all the speculation, all the sensationalism, these are real cases with real victims.
Absolutely. And their stories deserve to be told with sensitivity and respect.
For sure.
That's where responsible journalism comes in, and ethical investigation, finding the truth without exploiting the tragedy.
And remembering that behind every cold case are families and friends who are still grieving, still searching for answers, still hoping for justice.
And that pain, it doesn't go away. It often gets worse.
It's heartbreaking, for the families and for anyone who believes that justice can prevail.
Even after all these years, even after decades.
It shows us that the pursuit of justice, it's rarely a straight line.
It's a long and winding road filled with obstacles, setbacks, false hopes.
But even with all that, we have to keep searching, asking questions, keeping the memory of the victims alive.
Because even if we never find all the answers, the act of searching, of remembering, of refusing to let these cases be forgotten, it's powerful.
It is. It honors the victims, acknowledges their lives, their loss, and it reminds the world that they haven't been forgotten.
Sometimes that's all we can do, but it's still important.
It is. Now let's jump back into the timeline for a second. In 1982, there's this sudden burst of activity in Jean's case. The Metropolitan Police, they announced they're reviewing the case.
Oh, really? What happened?
It was because of some anonymous phone calls.
Interesting.
The details of those calls, they've never been released. But the police, they said they were, quote, very interested in what they'd learned.
This must have been huge for Jean's family and friends.
Mhm.
After years of silence, finally, some movement, a sign that maybe the case wasn't entirely forgotten.
It's like someone out there knew something, something important, and finally decided to speak up.
It makes you wonder, what was it about that moment in 1982 that prompted those calls? A change in circumstances, a guilty conscience, fear of being exposed.
We can only speculate, right?
Right.
But the fact that the police made public statements ruling out American servicemen and links to other crimes, it suggests maybe they were focusing on a new suspect, a new angle.
Like the investigation took a sudden turn, a detour onto a road less traveled.
And then, just as quickly as it started, the momentum stalled. No new developments, no arrests.
Another dead end in a case already riddled with them.
It's a familiar pattern with cold cases, isn't it? A burst of activity, hope, followed by disappointment and silence.
It's heartbreaking for the families and for anyone who believes in justice.
It is. It reminds us that the pursuit of justice, it's rarely a straight line, a clear path.
It's often a long and winding road full of obstacles and setbacks and false hope.
But even with all of that, there's still a reason to keep searching, to keep asking questions, to keep the memory of the victims alive.
Because even if we never have all the answers, the process of exploring these cases, it can be insightful. It teaches us about human nature, the limits of our justice system, the power of memory.
It reminds us that the past is never really past, that it echoes through time, shaping our present and future.
Exactly.
But let's sit back for a moment and consider this. We've gone through a lot of information about this case, but how much do we really know? Witness statements, police reports, forensic evidence, but the puzzle is still incomplete.
It's like looking at a tapestry with missing threads, trying to make out the full picture.
And while those missing threads can be frustrating, they can also be incredibly intriguing.
They invite us to speculate, to connect the dots, to become amateur sleuths alongside the investigators.
Exact.
And there's an element of, I don't know, historical voyeurism too, isn't there? We're peering into a window of the past, trying to understand the social and cultural norms of a different time.
And through that window, we see anxieties, fears, societal issues that still resonate today.
It's like we're holding up a mirror to ourselves, examining how far we've come and how much we still have to learn.
Themes like the fear of the outsider, the anxieties about safety in public spaces, questions about justice and accountability, they transcend time and place.
Absolutely. And it's by exploring those themes through the lens of a cold case, through the specifics of Jean Townsend's story, that we can gain a deeper understanding, not just of the past, but of ourselves and the world we live in today.
I couldn't agree more.
So with all the evidence we've discussed, the theories, what stands out to you as the most perplexing aspect of this case?
It always comes back to motive for me. Why? Was this a random act of violence? Did Jean just encounter someone on her way home that night? Or was she targeted?
It's a question that haunts this case, especially because there was no sexual assault. If it wasn't robbery and it wasn't a crime of passion, then what was it?
And we can't ignore the possibility that Jean's murder was part of a larger pattern of violence against women. The similarities in the attacks, the descriptions, the locations, it's hard to dismiss.
It's a disturbing thought that there might be a connection between these cases' other victims out there.
And some of those cases are still unsolved.
Which just adds to the mystery and the urgency of finding answers.
It does.
It's tough, for the families, waiting for answers, sometimes for decades.
It really is, and I think it adds another layer of complexity for the investigators too, right?
Oh, absolutely. The emotional weight of these cases, it can be immense.
I bet.
Investigators, they're not just solving a puzzle. They're carrying the hopes and expectations of families who have been waiting, sometimes for decades, for answers.
It's a huge responsibility.
It is. It's about empathy, understanding, a commitment to finding justice for those who can no longer speak for themselves.
And acknowledging that justice, well, sometimes it doesn't come in the form of a neat and tidy resolution, right?
Sometimes it's about piecing together fragments of truth, honoring the victims, making sure their stories aren't forgotten.
Keeping that hope alive, even when it feels impossible.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's fast forward again to 1971. Another murder rocks South Ruislip. This time, it's Gloria Booth, a 29-year-old housewife.
Oh, no.
And she's found strangled with a scarf, just like Jean Townsend. And this is where that term, Ruislip's murder mile, it really takes hold in the media.
Wow, so even after all those years, the shadow of Jean's unsolved murder, it's still there.
It is. It's like this unsettling undercurrent, a feeling that something dark and unresolved is still lurking beneath the surface.
And it's not just Jean's case, right? We've talked about all these other unsolved murders and attacks on women in the area, and some of them might be connected.
Right. It's like a puzzle with all these missing pieces, and each unsolved crime just adds another layer of complexity.
Exactly. And Ruslip's murder mile, it sounds sensational, but it reflects a real fear that gripped the community.
It does. And back then, remember, there wasn't the same access to information that we have now.
Right. No internet, no 24-hour news cycle.
People relied on local papers, word of mouth, and their own imaginations to fill in the gaps.
And when there are no answers, fear and speculation, well, they take over.
It's a natural human response, right? We try to create narratives, connect the dots, make sense of the chaos, even if it means, bending the truth a little.
The media, too, they play a role in shaping those narratives, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not.
Like with Ruslip's murder mile, it's become part of the local folklore, a chilling reminder of these unsolved crimes.
It's almost as if the term itself has taken on a life of its own, this self-perpetuating cycle of fear and fascination.
But we have to remember, behind all the speculation, all the headlines, these are real cases with real victims.
Absolutely. Their stories deserve to be treated with sensitivity and respect.
For sure. And it's a reminder that responsible journalism and ethical investigation, they're so important.
It's about finding a balance, informing the public while protecting the privacy and dignity of those involved.
Seeking the truth without exploiting the tragedy.
Exactly.
And never forgetting the families and friends who are still grieving, still searching for answers, still hoping for justice.
Their pain, it doesn't just fade away, it often intensifies.
It's heartbreaking for the families and for anyone who believes in the power of justice.
It reminds us that the pursuit of justice is rarely a straight line, a clear path. It's a long and winding road full of obstacles, setbacks, false hope.
But even with all that, we have to keep searching, keep asking questions, keep the memory of the victims alive.
Because even if we never find all the answers, the act of searching, of remembering, of refusing to let these cases be forgotten, it's a powerful statement.
It is. It honors the victims, acknowledges their lives, their loss, and reminds the world that they haven't been forgotten.
Sometimes that's all we can do, but it's still important.
Now let's jump back to the timeline one last time. In 1982, there's this sudden flurry of activity in Jean's case.
Oh, really? What happened?
The Metropolitan Police, they announced they're reviewing the case, and it's because of some anonymous phone calls they received.
Interesting.
The details of those calls, they've never been made public, but at the time, the police said they were very interested in what they had learned.
After all these years of silence, this must have been a huge development for Jean's family and friends. A sign that maybe, just maybe, the case wasn't completely forgotten.
It's like someone out there knew something crucial, and finally decided to come forward.
It makes you wonder, what was it about that moment in 1982 that prompted those calls? A change in circumstances, a guilty conscience, the fear of being exposed.
We can only speculate, right?
Of course.
But the police, they made these public statements ruling out American servicemen and links to other crimes, which suggests maybe they had a new suspect, a new angle they were pursuing.
Like the investigation took a sudden turn, a detour onto a road less traveled.
Exactly. But then, just as quickly as it started, the momentum stalled. No further developments, no arrests.
It's a familiar pattern with cold cases, isn't it? A burst of activity, a surge of hope, followed by disappointment and silence.
It's heartbreaking, for the families and for anyone who believes that justice should prevail, even after all this time.
It's a stark reminder that the pursuit of justice is rarely a straight line, a clear path. It's often a long and winding road, full of obstacles and setbacks and false hope.
But even with all that, we have to keep searching, keep asking questions, keep the memory of the victims alive.
Because even if we never find all the answers, the act of exploring these cases, it can teach us so much. It teaches us about the complexities of human nature, the limits of our justice system, the power of memory.
It reminds us that the past is never truly past, that it echoes through time, shaping our present and our future.
And sometimes, in the absence of concrete answers, we're left to grapple with ambiguity, to accept that some mysteries may never be fully solved.
It's true, and as we wrap up our deep dive into the unsolved murder of Jean Townsend, we want to leave you with this thought. What unsolved mysteries are you drawn to? What cold cases capture your imagination?
Don't be afraid to explore them, to ask questions, to dig deeper. You never know what you might uncover or how your curiosity might contribute to the ongoing search for truth and justice.
And maybe, just maybe, someone listening right now has a piece of the puzzle, a memory, a detail, something that could help bring Jean's story to a close. It's never too late to come forward, to share what you know.
Even if you don't have any direct information about the case, you can still help by keeping the story alive, by talking about it, by sharing it with others. Sometimes all it takes is one conversation, one spark of recognition to reignite the flame of justice.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. And remember, every cold case is a story waiting to be told, a voice waiting to be heard. Let's keep listening.